This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
By Mr. and Mrs. David Callis in memory of Moshe Yehuda ben Menachem Manois and Rivka, Lila Nishmas Rivka Bas Yehuda Aryeh. Shamash Shav and Aliyah should be Melitze Yesharim for the entire Callis Mishpacha. Ad Yimois HaMashiach. Ad v'yad b'chlal. Okay, good morning, Rabbi. We're learning Parak Ches of Sefer Ezra, and even though Pesach is approaching, and I must admit I had a real itch to learn in Yoni Pesach, but nevertheless I figured we're at the end of the Parak, so let's just finish up the Parak. Actually, we only have one pasuk left to the parak, so I figured we'll finish up the parak, and then we'll do Inyane Pesach. But then I realized that this last pasuk here is a real whopper, and either we could read it and just go through it, brush it off, or if you want to understand it, you have to learn the whole Amud of Gemara. So I chose the latter, and it's really an excellent example of how if you don't learn the Gemara, you really don't understand what the Navi is talking about. So we're talking about Ezra's return, and during Ezra's return, now the Beis Hamikdash was already running, but now Ezra returns and they're bringing karbanos. Look in pasuk Ches Lamed Hey. Haboim mehashvi, parak Ches, pasuk Lamed Hey. Haboim mehashvi, those who came back from captivity, Bnei Hagoyla, the sons of Galus, Hikrivu Oilos, they offered Oila we know is a complete offering, an elevated offering. Leilokei Yisrael. Parim Shnei Masar, 12 bulls Al Kol Yisrael, for all the Jews. Elim, rams, Tishim Veshisha, 96. Now, 96 is an interesting number. 96 is divided by what? 16. By 8 and by 12, right? 12 times 8.
24. Also by 24.
Also by 24.
16.
But what's
24 times 4?
What's 24? What's 12 times 8?
96.
96. Okay, we'll see. The reason I mentioned it's divided by 12 is the parim we get. 12 parim, presumably for each shevet, right? But 96 kvasim, elim, what's the number 96? Maybe it's 8 for each shevet. Kvasim shivim b'shiva. Kvasim, lambs, 77. Now what's 77? That's a very unusual number. The last time in the Torah it says 77, it's, im ki im shivasayim yukam kayin v'lemech shivim v'shiva. Right? But what does that have to do with anything? Tzefirei chata shnei masar, 12 male goats, hakoil oila lashem. All of these karbanos were a carbon oila. Now that's also very strange. What do you mean they're all an oila? We just said 12 of the he-goats were chatas. A chatas is not an oila, and an oila is not a chatas. So why would the pasuk conclude hakoil oila lashem? So if we were just learning this, in somewhere, we might just say, okay, weiter. But if we take a look in Rashi, Hikrivu oilos, they brought oilos, hakoil oila, everything was a oila, v'hoira shahisa. It was a one-time dispensation. It certainly doesn't explain anything, but it's saying that these karbanos were a hoira shah. Rabbi say, we have to ask ourselves a number of questions. Number one, if some of the karbanos, the pasuk says explicitly were karbanos chatas, how could the pasuk end hakoil oila lashem? And number two, why would they bring a carbon chatas? What did they do wrong? Did you read anything that these people did wrong in Sefer Ezra? Doesn't say anywhere they did anything wrong. What did they bring a carbon chatas for? So Rabbi say, whenever you see a par and a sa'ir is indicative of something. The Mishnah says in Masechta Hayriyos, one of my favorite Masechtas, that the Mishnah says like this: that when the majority of Klal Yisrael does an Avera based on the Bezdin, then you bring something called a Par Helam Davar Shel Tzibur. What if they served Avodah Zarah based on the Bezdin? Then you bring a Par and a Sa'ir. A Par as an Oila, and a Sa'ir as a Chatas. So that would fit very well into this pasuk, because it says the Parim were brought as what? Oila Yisrael Yisrael Parim 12. And then Sefirei Chatas, he-goats, Shnei Masar 12. So maybe they're bringing karbanos for Avodah Zarah. The question is, they never violated Avodah Zarah. These are from a Yidden. When did they violate Avodah Zarah? So Rabbi say, I want to give out a sheet to you. This is Gemara in Hariyos, Heyam Beis Vav Amud Aleph. We'll just see part of it, but it's a very, very enlightening Gemara, and you have a similar Gemara in Masechta Temura on Daf Tezvav. Okay, take a look at the Gemara. And the Gemara is going to say an amazing thing. First, we're going to see from this Gemara why they brought all these karbanos. And we're going to see from this Gemara exactly how many Jews are returning, of what age they are, and it's a very enlightening Gemara. So take a look in the sheet. Before the Gemara discusses this episode in Ezra, the Gemara discusses another episode, and that is the moment in time when the Levium took over for the Bechayrim. Why did the Levium take over for the Bechayrim? Any Bechayrim over here? Okay. So, what did we do wrong? How did the Bechayrim, how did they, the Egel. They served Avodah Zarah. The Bechayrim were involved in the Egel, the Levium were not. So we lost our rights, right? And Rosham Zalman Auerbach says that's Tainus Bechayrim is actually the Bechayrim fast because they lost the ability to be Makriv Karbanos. Why Dafka Erev Pesach? Because that's the one day of the year that more Karbanos are brought than any other day, and it's the one day the Bechayrim, they feel their loss more than any other day. But that was a case where many Jews served Avodah Zarah. So take a look. Now we would expect, when you bring a carbon for Avodah Zarah, what should you bring? A par as an oila, and a sayr as a chatas. But we'll see, the Levium did not bring a par as an oila and a sayr as a chatas, they brought two parim. Tanya, Reb Shimon Omer, Ma Talmud Omer, Upar Sheni ben Bakar Tikach Lechatas. It says, Esapar Echad, I read to you the pasuk, V'lakchu par ben Bakar u'menchasai soilas bulav Hashemen, Upar Sheni ben Bakar Tikach Lechatas. Ma Talmud Omer Upar Sheni ben Bakar Tikach Lechatas. Okay, this is talking about when the Levium were inaugurated. If it's telling you that there are two karbanos, it's not one par, it's two parim. Haloik Far Nemar already says earlier, V'yasa eso echad chatas, v'yaso echad oila l'Hashem. That one is brought as a chatas, and one is brought as an oila. So we already know there are two, so why would the pasuk have to repeat, V'yas hasheni uparsheni ben bakar tikach lechatas? Elo yachal, I might think, tehei necheles chatas la Leviim, that the Leviim could eat the carbon chatas. Now normally everybody knows the carbon oila. Who eats the carbon oila? Nobody. It's kula kalil, right? It's completely consumed in the fire. Nobody eats the carbon oila. But a carbon chatas is often eaten by the bailam, depending on where the blood is sprinkled. If the blood is sprinkled on the inside, on the Mizbeach HaZahav, then I believe nobody eats it. If the blood is sprinkled on the outside, then the bailam could eat the meat of the chatas. Now this particular carbon chatas was, I believe, the blood was it was burnt on the outside. So if it was burnt on the outside, you would think that the Levium are allowed to eat it. Okay? Yachal te'necheles chatas la Levium. By the way, the Mefarshim say it means the Kaihanim, because they're the ones being makar of it. Talmud loymar upar sheni. Therefore it says, and the second bowl. Sheni la'oila. It's part of a group. The oila and the chatas. Ma oila loy necheles. Af chatas loy necheles. right? Yeah, the Beersheba points out, you would think you could eat the carbon chatas because the blood is sprinkled on the outside, and whenever chatas, the blood is sprinkled on the outside, normally it could be eaten. And here it's saying, no, it's like the carbon oil. Okay, got it? So Levium, when they took over from the Bechorim, they were makriv of par as an oila, par as a chatas. You would think you could eat the chatas. The Torah says, no, it's sheni. You can't eat the chatas. It's like the oila. Now, you ready for this? Yeah? You had a good breakfast this morning?
Yeah.
Good. So now you'll be ready to get the next Gemara. Because the next Gemara happens to be on the pasuk we just learned in Sefer Ezra. Take a look. Kiyotzebai. Likewise, Amar Rabbi Yossi. Now have in mind that the Gemara introduces a discussion of the pasuk we just learned with the words Kiyotzebai. Seemingly there's a connection between the karbanos that were brought when the Levium took over for the Bechorim and the following. Amar Rabbi Yossi. Haboe hashvi, those who came back from captivity. B'nei hagoyla hikrivu oilos alekei Yisrael. Parim shnei masar. Right? I'll call Yisrael. Elim tishim v'shisha, kvasim shivim v'shiva, tzvir chata shnei masar, hakoil oila l'Hashem. Does that pasuk sound familiar? Yeah? That's the pasuk we just learned in Sefer Ezra, the last pasuk of Parak Ches. But the Gemara asks, hakoil oila sakadaitach? Does the pasuk really mean everything is brought as an oila? Efshir shechatas oila? A chatas is not an oila. There are many differences between a chatas and an oila. An oila is completely consumed. In oila you sprinkle the blood under the line on the mizbeach. A chatas you sprinkle it over the line. There are many differences. Ela hakoil ki oila. Ma oila loine acheles, af chatas loine acheles. Just like you can't eat an oila, they cannot eat the chatas that Ezra brought in those days. The Tanya, because we learned in a Brayso, look carefully. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, ala avodas koichavim heviyom. They brought the carbon for avodah zara. They brought the carbon for avodah zara. What avodah zara? V'amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel, ala avodas koichavim sha'asu b'meit tzidkiyahu. The people in the times of Ezra brought karbanos for the idolatry in the times of Tzidkiyahu. Rabbi said, does anybody know who Tzidkiyahu was? Good. The last king of the kingdom of Yehuda before the Churban Bayis Rishon. So wait a second. Ezra is at the end of the 70 years after Bayis Rishon. And they're bringing karbanos for Avodah Zarah that took place more than 70 years earlier? So the Chayfetz Hashem, who I believe is... What?
Why is that a question if we've had already a similar situation beforehand? I mean, we say that we use the carbon Pesach that we do is because part of it was because of the the Jews. And then you had again...
Okay, carbon Pesach is to keep us away from Avodah Zarah, but to bring a carbon Chatas for someone who died a long time ago. There's a halacha that chatas shemesu ba'aleha, that once somebody dies, you don't bring a carbon chatas for them. They already got kapara with misa. So to bring a chatas for someone who died is not halachically allowed. Okay, and yet the Gemara is saying they brought karbanos, a par as a oila and a sar as a chatas for the avodah zarah in the times of Tzidkiyahu. Now listen carefully. The Archaim HaKadosh wrote a sefer on Hariyos. I think it's called Chayfetz Hashem. He says maybe they brought for their own avodah zarah. How do you know they brought for Tzidkiyahu's avodah zarah? So he says if you look through the Nevi'im, nowhere are those Jews accused of serving avodah zarah. The only thing we're going to see they're accused of is they lived with Goyim. They had relations with Goyim. But we don't find anywhere that they themselves worshipped avodah zarah. So therefore we have no choice but to say it was for the avodah zarah in the time of Tzidkiyahu. Chassam Sofer says that even if you say they did worship avodah zarah, but we don't care what people do when they're not in Eretz Yisrael. We only care about the averos of Eretz Yisrael. Outside of Eretz Yisrael, we don't bring karbanos for such a thing. That's what Chassam Sofer says.
You don't get eject.
That's what, based on the Gemara on Daf Gimel, that the Karbanis Sibor, not that we don't care, we don't bring a carbon Sibor for Chatan that took place outside of Eretz Yisrael. Okay, so very interesting. So now, why are they bringing Karbanis Avodah Zarah? For the Avodah Zarah that took place during the times of Tzidkiyahu. Now, I'm going to say outside, in the Gemara in Harios, in the Mishnah in Harios, on Daf Daud Amud Beis, the Gemara brings three opinions as to how many karbanos are brought when Klal Yisrael does an avera of Avodah Zarah based on the Bezdin. Rameir holds the carbon is incumbent on the Bezdin, so even if all of Klal Yisrael sins, you only bring one par and one sayr. Rabbi Yehuda says every shevet brings separately. Reb Shimon says they both bring the Bezdin and the Shvatim. Okay, so let's see this inside. So the Gemara is going to ask, Bishlam Rabbi Yehuda. I understand according to Rabbi Yehuda, who says every shevet brings a carbon. That's how you have 12 parim and 12 seirim. Mishkachas la lahani shnei masar chatois. That's how you have these 12 chatois. Kagoin dechatu shnei masar shvatim. Demaisu shnei masar seirim. Or Rabbi Yehuda also holds of a little trick that if the majority of the shvatim sin, the other shvatim get dragged along. Inami dechatu shiva shvatim, or 7 shvatim sinned. V'sha'ara, Enach, v'greir, and the rest of them get dragged along. What about Reb Shimon? Reb Shimon says the Shvatim bring and the Bezdin brings. He would answer, you have to say in the times of Tzidkiyahu, only 11 Shvatim sinned. So you know how you have 12 karbanos? 11 Shvatim and the Bezdin. Right? You got that? Reb Shimon holds every shevet brings and the Bezdin brings. So how do you have 12? It should be 13. 12 for the Shvatim and 1 for the Bezdin. So you have to say the case is 11 Shvatim sinned, and then the Bezdin on top of that. Okay? Well, Reb Shimon nami mishkachas lo kagon dechatu achad asar Shvatim, demaisu achad asar seirim, v'idach the Bezdin. But according to Reb Meir says, who brings the karbanos tzibur when the tzibur relies on the Bezdin? Only Bezdin. How do you have 12 karbanos? It should only be 1. Says the Gemara, they must have done it 12 different times. They sinned based on the Bezdin 12 times. They must have sinned 12 times. Now the Gemara asks the $1 million question, and that is, the people who served Avodah Zarah 70 years earlier, they're not here anymore. They're in the world to come. You don't bring a carbon chatas for someone who's dead. The halacha is chatas shemesu ba'aleha b'misa. If you separate, if let's say somebody separated a carbon chatas and then lo yaleno they die, you know what you do with that carbon chatas? You're not makriv it because the guy's already getting his kapara in the fires. He doesn't need to bring, the misa itself is machaper. So he doesn't need to bring a carbon chatas. Frak the Gemara v'hamaisi lahu hanu dechatu. The ones that sinned died. And then the Gemara goes through a whole shakla v'taya. Well, maybe this halacha that a chatas shemesu ba'aleh is only a yachid. A yachid could die. A tzibur can never die. And to which the Gemara ultimately rejects that, and the Gemara has to give a new answer. And that, again, the question is, but they died. The people who worshipped Avodah Zarah in the times of Tzidkiyahu died. So I want you to skip down to the third to last narrow line. Got that? Ein hachinami. Really? They're bringing karbanos for the Avodah Zarah that was performed in the time of Tzidkiyahu. They died? Says the Gemara, no they didn't. They're still alive. People who worshipped Avodah Zarah 70 years earlier in the time of Tzidkiyahu, they're still kicking. Says the Gemara, I'll bring you a proof. Dichsiv, and this is also why I wanted to learn this Gemara. The Gemara quotes a pasuk in Ezra Perek Gimel. Dichsiv. This is Ezra Gimel Yud Beis. V'rabim meha kohanim v'halavim v'rashei ha'avos. Many of the kohanim, levim, and family heads. Asher ro es habayis harishan biyastai. Who they saw the first bias. Biyastai zeh habayis beineim. When they saw the inauguration of the second bias. Boichem b'kol gadol. They cried. V'rabim b'shrua. And many of them were happy. B'simcha laharim koil. Now, I don't have the cheshbon in front of me, but I just thought, okay, we'll get that in a minute. What do you see from here? That at the inauguration of the second Beis HaMikdash, there are a lot of people who remember the first Beis HaMikdash. That means the people there were more than 70 years old. So this is not a chata shemesu ba'aleha. The owners, the people who worshipped Avodah Zarah in the time of Tzidkiyahu HaMelech, they weren't dead. They were alive. They were there. They were witnessing the inauguration of the second Beis HaMikdash. So it's not a problem. You can't bring a karma chatas for people who died. They didn't die. They had Alta Yidden who remembered Bayis Rishon. And this is something we pointed out, right? That there were people who remember, especially by the Levium. We said, yeah, there were Levium. Remember, we said there were Levium, but those were Levium. Taisa said in Yevamos, those were the Levium who what? Bit off their fingers 70 years earlier. But now the Gemara asks another question. Listen to this. This is going to flip. Hold on to your socks. Listen to this. V'dilma meyutin havo, v'lo rabim havo. Very nice, there were some Yidden, but how many Yidden do you think there were who are so old that remember the first Beis HaMikdash? You would think it's only a handful, right? You would think of all the returnees, you would think the majority of the returnees were young pioneers, right? Look at 1948. Who's returning to Eretz Yisrael? Old people on Cain? Young people. Right? So and if they're a minority of people are not able to bring a korban chatas if the majority of the congregation didn't sin. In other words, let's say you had 100,000 people who returned. If 10 of them were from the idolaters of the first Beis HaMikdash and the other 99,990 never worshipped, so then you can't bring a korban chatas for them. Says the Gemara, Ha'aksiv, no. The vast majority of the people who returned by Bayis Sheni were old Yidden who remembered Bayis Rishon. The young people did not come back. You hear this chiddush? Hear what the Gemara is saying? The overwhelming majority of Jews who returned to build the second Beis HaMikdash were those who remembered the glory of the first Beis HaMikdash. The Jews who were born in Bavel or grew up in Bavel said, Bavel is wonderful, we're not coming. In distinction to, this generation. Right? But very interesting, says the Gemara, no. Haksiv, that when, right, the Pasuk says there were people crying because they remember the first Beis HaMikdash. There were people laughing in appreciation of the second Beis HaMikdash. And the sound of the crowd crying was so loud, it drowned out the side of the joyousness. So what do you see from there? Who was the majority? The majority were old Yidden. This is an amazing thing, right? So it's important to know. We're learning Sefer Ezra. If you get anything from Sefer Ezra, it should be the knowledge, the yediyah, that most Jews did not return. Most Jews stayed back in Bavel, and of the Jews who returned, the majority of them were old. So you can imagine, you're trying to rebuild Yerushalayim with old Sabrachana Yidden, right? To remember the first Beis HaMikdash. Okay, now I just want to point out that the fact that the Gemara is invoking the Pasuk, listen to this. What Pasuk does the Gemara prove that there were old people in the times of Ezra returning? Because the Kohanim who returned remember the first Beis HaMikdash. Yeah? That Pasuk in Parag Gimel was not said now when Ezra's returning and he's bringing the Karban Chatas. That was said in the first wave of return, before Ezra came back. Ezra didn't come back right away. Right? Remember we learned Ezra came back because he was with his Rabbi Baruch. In other words, who has a timeline over here? Anybody? Who has a timeline? Ezra returned, I believe, 18 years later. Ezra was returning, right? In terms of Ezra's return in relation to the building of the Beis HaMikdash, how many years was it?
It had already started, no?
When was it complete? It was completed in the 3rd day of the month of Adar, with the 6th year of Daryavesh. So he came up in the 7th year, right? He came up in the 7th year of Daryavesh. He came up a year later. Now in Perek Gimel, Perek Gimel is when? Who was king in Perek Gimel? Daryavesh wasn't even king yet, right? Koresh was the king. So those Kohanim who remembered the first Beis HaMikdash, it's not so simple for the Gemara just to say, yeah, they were old Yidden. Those old Yidden who cried when they saw the Beis HaMikdash, they were crying when they saw the foundations of the Beis HaMikdash. But now we're talking about already in the 7th year of Daryavesh. That was much, much earlier. How long did the Beis HaMikdash sit before it was completed? Anybody know?
According to them, the Daryavesh came on the scene in 353.
What?
It was from 370 to 367.
Did you change it? We made a correction, remember, in the timeline? Did you change it in yours?
What was the other one? Two was... I think we changed it when they had the different kings. Yucking.
I'm pointing out that the Gemara. What page is that? What are you looking at?
In the art scroll?
Yeah.
58. Introductions.
I'm just pointing out the fact that the Gemara cites Perek Gimel, that there were old Yidden, that doesn't necessarily mean they're still alive in the times of Ezra. That's a big chiddush that the Gemara is saying that they're still alive. Now let's finish up the Gemara over here. Okay, let's continue in the Gemara. The Gemara asks, now normally when the tzibur brings the paras and oila and asaras achatas for avodah zarah, that's only if the tzibur does it b'shogeg. Not here. In the times of Tzidkiyahu, they did it b'mezid. Gemara says v'hamazidin havu. They did it b'mezid. Says that aspect of it was a temporary dispensation. Says the Gemara hachinami mistabra. Because if you don't say it was a one-time dispensation, if you're going to say, yeah, this fits perfectly with the normal rule that when Klal Yisrael sins with avodah zarah, you bring a paras and oila and asaras achatas, how are you going to explain Elam Tishem B'Shisha, 96 rams, Kvasim Shivim B'Shiva, Kineged Mi? Who did that correspond to? Ella Hayras Shah Haysa. But rather it was a Hayras Shah. Hachanami, here too, Hayras Shah Haysa. Now, by the way, once the Gemara comes on to Hayras Shah, then you don't have to say anymore that the ones who served the Avodah Zarah were still alive. Maybe you could say they died. It's a chata shemesu ba'aleha. It's a Hayras Shah.
What is Hayras Shah?
Hayras Shah means a one-time special dispensation that, despite the fact that it's normally not done, we allow it under these. Now, we have a same Gemara in Masechta Temura, and there, now from our Gemara, it seems like the question is, what's the 96 kvasim for? What's the 77 elim for? Well, actually, what's the 96 elim for? What's the 77 kvasim for? In Temura, the Gemara just asks, Ela kavasim keneged mi. The Gemara doesn't ask, who are the elim keneged? Says the Vilna Gaon, it's unbelievable. Right? Unbelievable. See the Gra? You see his mastery over Shas? The Gra, imagine, first of all, that means he knew Harias and Temura. That's the first thing, right? And he picked up on the fact that in Harios it asks, what are the elim for? What are the kvasim for? And in Temura, the Gemara only asks, what are the kvasim for? So Gemara wants to know. He's sitting there in his room. What about the elim? Why is the Gemara bothered by the elim? Says the Gaon, Yesh Laimar, Shehekrivu Shmaina L'chol Shevet. The elim are 96. 96 is divisible by 12. They could have brought 8 for each Shevet. But 77 is not divisible by 12. So where did the 77 kvasim come from? Okay? One last thing. The mitzvah Esan.
What are they doing it for the other world? Destroy the basement. This mitzvah was a good thing for them to have, right?
Yeah. 2 more things. A few more things. 3 more things. What?
So
Sorry.
have to figure out the other 7 then.
The other...
77, right? So 70 is...
Oh, you mean maybe it's for the Ummais Ha'olam.
Right. And you have on Sukkot,
Right. Right. What do you do with the other 7? I don't know.
Right.
Listen to this. The Gemara had a kasha, but the people died. So Gemara says, no, they're still alive. They're still alive. Now, who are they bringing karbanos for? Again, Rabbi said, who are they bringing karbanos for? The Avodah Zarah that was performed in the time of Tzidkiyahu. Now, who is Tzidkiyahu? The last king of Yehuda. Where were the Asaras Hashvatim at that point?
Well, who brought him back?
1 second. At the time that Tzidkiyahu, at the time that we supposedly served Avodah Zarah in the time of Tzidkiyahu, where were the 10 tribes? They were gone. So if they were gone, why would 12 Shvatim have to bring a Chatas for all members of all 12 Shvatim? 10 of them were gone already.
2.
All right. Oh, you only had 2.
Oh, it's an odd number.
So, but again, why 12? We're assuming all the Shvatim sinned, but 10 of them had already been exiled. So the Chazon Ish says in Harios that the Gemara Megillah says in Yadaleh that Yirmiyahu brought them back.
Right. So they were around for 60 years.
So fine, they brought them back. And even if you don't say like that, not every single member of the Aseres Hashvatim were exiled. But now there's another question. Fine. So there were Jews from all 10 Shvatim who sinned in the time of Tzidkiyahu. But even if you want to say Yirmiyahu brought them back, but did they, when they were exiled to Bavel, did they return to Eretz Yisrael with Ezra? If you look in the beginning of Sefer Ezra, it only talks about Yehuda and Binyamin. But if you remember, the Ramban said the other Shvatim were not allowed to return because of the Shvuah. So that's a machlokes Rishonim, whether any of the Aseres Hashvatim returned by Bayis Sheni.
Which shul was that?
What?
Shul and where now?
The Shvuah that Lo Yalu B'Chayma. Okay, one last thing. Okay? One last thing. One last thing. If you have the mitzvah Esan asks that Ezra was makriv karbanos kvasim and elim as a hayrasha. What do you mean as a hayrasha? Normally we say that yesh koyach l'chachamim lakar davar min haTorah b'sheva al tasa. The chachamim could cease and desist. They could passively say, don't do a mitzvah. But to bring a carbon, which normally should not be brought, and really should be chulin, is bekum va'aseh, bringing chulin into the azara. So you're violating the Torah, bekum va'aseh. So how are they allowed to do that? They're not allowed to bekum va'aseh, violate the Torah. So, what?
Where's it going?
The mitzvah Esan in the Masechta Hariyos. Who is it? It's one of the Hagois. I don't remember. One of the Hagois in the back of Masechta Hariyos. That's a good question. How are they allowed to do this? You ready? You ready for the question? V'kashali ha'kaimelon de'inavi rashay l'chadesh davar l'hakal divrei Torah b'kum aseh va'afilu l'shah. Only as a migdar milsa, only as a gezerah. So therefore, how could Ezra be moira to be makriv a carbon chatas on a mazid? His question is on the mazid. The Gemara asked, but it's a mazid. The Gemara says it's hayrasha. But how could you do that? Ha'ika isser min haTorah, to bring a chatas that you're not chayiv. Says the mitzvah Isan that Ezra had precedent to do this. What precedent did Ezra have to be makriv karbanos, a carbon chatas, even though the aver was done b'mezid? That's how we started off the shiur. That's how the beginning of the Gemara in Hariyah starts. The Gemara starts off by saying that in the times of Moshe Rabbeinu, they were makriv in order to inaugurate the Leviim who replaced the B'chayrim. What were they makriv? A par as a oila and a par as a chatas. But the B'chayrim who worshipped the Egel, did they do it accidentally or did they do it intentionally? They did it b'mezid. That means Moshe Rabbeinu already established that when you inaugurate a Beis HaMikdash and you're trying to atone for Avodah Zarah, even though it's b'mezid, you have a right to be makriv karbanos. Says in Mitzvah Isan, Mizeh lamad Ezra shehikriv chatois al oisan shavda v'escham v'meitzikel b'mezid. That's exactly the same way in the times of Moshe they didn't eat the chatos. So too in times of Ezra. And now we understand why the Brisa that we started off in Masechta Hariyos, after quoting the karbanos of the Leviim, and then when it segues into the karbanos of Ezra, how does it do that? Ki yotzei bai. Remember that on the first narrow line? Ki yotzei bai. Why does it say ki yotzei bai? Because the chatos of Leviim, from the chatos of the Leviim, we learned out the chatos of Ezra. And says the mitzvah Isan, those karbanos that Moshe brought were subsumed under the category of karbanos miluim. So too these karbanos of Ezra also in a way were karbanos miluim. And it's not a new hayrasha completely, but there was precedent from the time of Ezra. Okay, Rabbi say. So here, how many psukim did we learn today? We learned one pasuk. What? For precedent from Moshe, right, from Moshe. But you see that this one pasuk is really loaded, comes fully loaded. Okay, Rabbi say, have a wonderful day.
Learning Talmud. One talk. You can't learn from anything else.
But can we get the dates over here? How many years after those people returned did Ezra come? Did we make a correction in your book over there?
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.